Let's start with the basics. And just a quick note, I'm going to go through a lot of material here very quickly. And if you miss something, it's fine, don't worry. We'll have the slides available for you later. But I do want to go through a little bit fast so that we can get you to the Zoho University session, which is really important for you to hear. So what's the first thing you have to do before you go after the international market? You have to get your product ready. What does that mean? First, internationalization and localization for both web and mobile. Now, it's important to have both, right? So what languages would you start with? You already have English, let's say. Well, it depends on your app, but just to give you a general idea, these are some of the more popular languages that most app makers start with when they start to internationalize. And you can see the common thing here is that you'll have a lot of reach with the minimal amount of effort. Even within a single language, you do have different dialects. Like even in English, you have US English and UK English. And the differences between them are not limited to just spelling, right? You also have some slight grammar differences, vocabulary. So you have to pay attention to all of that just to finish up making that last mile effort for localization. The best way to get started quickly with doing this is get your internationalization file ready. That file's basically you have the list of all the strings that are the phrases mentioned in your app, and those are the list of all the phrases that you want translated into your target languages. So have that file ready, get it sent to professional translators. And if possible, when you do that, include some of the future phrases that you will have in your app. Maybe you're working on a feature that's not ready yet, but you know it's coming down the pipe, so include some of those future phrases right then so that you don't have to go back and go through this process again, help speed up that process. Another thing you can do that we have found is that translation can actually be crowdsourced. And what that means is, the way we do it, we have an app, let's say, we did this for Zoho Sheet, I believe, where the users who are using the app, they can volunteer, and while they're using the app, they'll click on a phrase in English or some other language that's already there, and they can volunteer a translation for that phrase right while they're using the app. Once that's done, let's say you've gotten enough feedback through the app in that process, you can have an expert review that and then publish it. So why would you do this if you're still using an expert? Why wouldn't you go straight to the expert? Well, the reason is the crowd, the users of your apps, they have domain knowledge that a general translator won't necessarily have. So that helps you avoid situations where you have some kind of a literally correct but awkward translation that doesn't really make sense for your target market. When you do this, you have to remember the differences between web and mobile. The search strings and descriptions in the mobile app stores are going to be localized, all of them. So you have to pay careful attention to those, not just the content on your website. The content is the focus on the web. But on mobile, all of your focus has to be on the description because there's no full website for your users to browse through when they find you through the App Store. It's very important not to use Google Translate for this. It's not worth the savings. It's just, there's nothing against Google Translate. It's a great tool, but it's not good enough for this purpose. So don't end up on one of those joke screenshot sites with some awkward, horrible mistranslation. Just 3 more quick things to go through. One, multi-currency support. Beyond just the currencies, you also have format differences when you display amounts in different currencies, right? Sometimes you'll use commas in one country, periods in another, maybe a comma or period every 2 or 3 zeros. All this varies by country, so just pay a little bit of attention to all of that. Time zones. If you've built your app maybe just for India, then you might not have put in multiple time zone support since there's only one time zone here. So as you internationalize, you need to be able to support this. You also have to consider that a lot of countries will shift their time zone during the year, like in the US, we have daylight saving time. Some other units to consider, you have to support metric and imperial if you're in countries that have both. Date formats are very important because they can actually lead to, they don't just look bad, they can lead to errors, right? If you have month, day, year, and you confuse that with day, month, year. In fact, we still screw this up sometimes, so don't feel bad if you screw it up, but try to avoid it. Now, let's say you've done all of that, and now your product is ready to go out. The next question for you to answer is, where do you want to deploy first? And that depends, of course, on what your target market is. Let's say it's the US. That's a very common place to start first. One nice thing about the US as a target market is that almost everybody there is very comfortable paying online by credit card. So it's easy for them to get signups. That's not true of all markets. One good example of that right next door to the US is Mexico. It's very difficult to get people to pay online with credit cards in Mexico. It's just not very common. In fact, there, they'll expect a full phone call with local language support from somebody there. It's not just Mexico. A lot of markets require localized sales and support. So if all that seems a little bit daunting at first to have all of these things set up, there's still plenty of English-speaking countries that you can target simultaneously without having to go after each of these different language markets. If you're starting with the US, the expectation among customers there is going to be for you to have a data center or a hosting setup in the US. So that raises the question, if you host in the US, will customers in other countries have a problem? And it depends on the country. Usually, most customers in the UK, Australia, the Netherlands, they'll probably be fine. Customers in France and Germany are usually not. They'll expect something more local. So you have to look into this before you launch anywhere. Because if you launch in the wrong country and you expect to target customers in that country without having all this set up correctly, you may find that your efforts are mostly wasted. This is especially true in Europe. You have to pay a lot of attention to the conditions in Europe. They have a number of agreements a lot of customers will expect you to have set up and signed. Safe harbor has been pretty big in the past. A lot of customers now, even a safe harbor agreement between your US outfit and the customer in Europe won't be enough. They'll expect you to sign something called a data processing agreement. Don't forget performance testing, obviously. It's not just about regulatory concerns and all of that. You have to be close enough to your users that they don't experience a lot of lag, latency when they use your app from whatever country they're in. There are a lot of tools you can use to test this ahead of time. We actually make one of them. It's called Site 24/7. Just some general guidelines. If you're targeting the US and Europe, then typically the East Coast of the US will make sense. If you're targeting Japan, Australia, and the US, the West Coast is probably better. You can host in multiple regions, of course. You don't have to pick just one, but you probably won't need to for some time. And the reason for that is there won't be any performance issues if your customers are distributed well enough that they don't all hit the server at the same time, right? While some of your customers are working, others may be asleep. You do need to be aware of local rules. Just a couple of quick examples that will illustrate this. Canadian businesses can't host health data in the US. They're not allowed to do that. And this is a very common sort of condition. You'll find most countries have very strict conditions around health information. So if any of your customers are in that sector, expect a lot of scrutiny and a lot of attention that you have to give to these kinds of conditions. It's a similar story for financial data. Switzerland especially is famous for this. They're extremely strict about their privacy rules. Another question that you'll probably get asked by a lot of customers is, what certifications and compliances do you have? When you're starting out, you may not even know what any of these are. Some of the common ones you'll hear are SAS 70 and SOC 2. A lot of times that you find customers asking for this, it'll sound like they absolutely need it, but it's usually not a deal breaker. So in the meantime, while you don't have these certifications, try to make sure that your customers feel comfortable and explain to them the kinds of procedures and precautions that you take, but be open about the fact that you don't have these certifications yet. And so don't worry that you don't have them now. Right now, it's probably fine that you don't have them. Later on, it can become worth it as you have the resources to deal with them later. In fact, we followed this advice. We just received our SOC 2 certification this year, and we started Zoho 9 years ago, and we just haven't lost many customers over it. We've seen from experience that most customers are really fine not having these certifications. One of the last critical questions for you to answer when you're deploying in another country is, how do you host and serve your app? Do you try to set up your own data center or set up in somebody else's data center, or do you use one of these infrastructures as service providers like Amazon EC2? Back when we started, something like EC2 was not really an option. So what we did was actually still pretty cheap. We went to a colo provider, and colo providers, for those of you who don't know, are basically, they're data centers where a bunch of companies pool together and share the same data center, and sometimes they'll get their own cage sectioned off portion of the data center for their own servers. But that's not the smallest level that you can start out at a colo provider. We actually started out with not even a full rack, which is just a kind of a shelf full of about 40 servers. We started out with just a quarter rack. So we had about 5 or 6 servers when we first started out. And you know, I don't remember the exact price, but it was extremely cheap, just not really a big deal. And this is still a perfectly viable option today. All of these colo data center providers will always have a service called Remote Hands available for you. And basically, it's exactly what it sounds like. They'll have a team on site where you can file a ticket anytime you need to, and they can go and do anything physical that needs to be done. So you don't have to have people on site at these providers. That's basically what we do ourselves. We manage our data center almost completely from Chennai, even though both of our data centers are in the United States. Now, if you don't need control over your hardware, if you don't actually have to physically access it or do much with it, these infrastructure as a service options like EC2 can be quite good for you. But you have to be careful, and depending on your goals, you have to be ready to switch very quickly. A good example of somebody who had to switch is Dropbox. They actually started out on Amazon for storage, and as you know, Dropbox is almost purely a storage business. So that became really expensive for them really quickly. And it's not either or. One thing to keep in mind, both of these can work together for you. You might have some workloads, some portions of your app being served from a hosting data center, some of them from something like EC2. One use case from our own example is we have an app called Zoho Meeting, which streams a lot of data in real time between users. But none of that needs to be saved, really. So it can be helpful for us to use something like EC2 for specific workloads, specific apps like that. But of course, we have our own data center for most of our other stuff. Another reason to look at something like EC2 is when you need to deploy in a new region very quickly, EC2-like providers are by far the fastest way to do that. There's no way to match that kind of speed where you just go to their website and sign up. Another thing to keep in mind when you deploy internationally, you have to provide customer support for your international customers, right? You can have resellers handle support for some countries. Whether you do that or not, you have to make sure that customers can get support during their working hours, not just yours. Supporting, if you have a freemium model app where some of your customers are free, it's perfectly fine to limit them to email-only support, but paid customers will expect phone support. Similar to what I said earlier, never reply to support emails using Google Translate. I don't think we've done this ourselves, but if we have, I'm sure it didn't go well. Let's talk a little bit about legal stuff. None of us are lawyers, but this should give you some good hints as to where to look. Trademark rules are different in each country. So you have to look carefully at what the trademark rules are in each and every country that you're operating in. China in particular has very unique rules. Apple actually ran into some trouble because they didn't really have their trademark situation perfectly set up in China. And if Apple can screw that up, anybody else in this room can, including ourselves. So you may want to file early there and take a look at the situation there as quickly as possible if you plan to enter China as a market. Now remember that it's not just your names or your app names that can be trademarked. Your taglines and other phrasings that you have can also be trademarked, so it may be worth doing that as well. When you get these trademarks, trademarks and domain names kind of go together. They can help reinforce each other legally as well. So you want to try to get trademarks and matching domain names in as many countries as you can. And of course, you don't want to look at just trademarks. You want to consider all of your intellectual property options. Not all countries have software patents. I believe India doesn't actually, but the United States and many other countries do. So, software patents are important even if you don't expect to protect yourself or aggressively go after anybody. You do need patents eventually to defend yourself against patent lawsuits from somebody else. Another common question that gets asked, where should you register your company? Where should you incorporate? Again, there's no general answer that fits everybody here. You have to investigate based on your needs. That applies to your corporate structure as well. You have to look at both of those and consider those carefully. Take the US as an example. It's pretty easy to make both of those decisions for the US. You can start an LLC, a limited liability company. You can do that from right here in India without having to go to the US. There are a bunch of sites like LegalZoom that'll help you do this. They can also help you file US taxes, which is something that you have to do as soon as you incorporate in the US. Another thing you can do, especially in the US, is you can hire these services that act as agents on your behalf, because you do need to have an official address in the US if you incorporate there. That doesn't mean you have to be there, or that you have to lease an office or anything like that. You can hire these agents. Maybe you incorporated in Texas, for example, because taxes are quite low there, and you hire an agent there to be your official point of contact. Once you do that, they'll collect all of your mail and email that gets sent from the government or anybody else, and they can forward it to you. And the cost of this is quite low. It's usually under $500 a year, so it's not something to worry about much. Another legal issue you have to consider as you're operating internationally, you have to pay attention to agreements and renewals. Many countries, you need an operating license of some kind to be doing business there, and you can't let that expire. It's as bad as if you had never gotten the license in the first place, so it's not a situation you want to be in. You don't want your trademarks to expire either. A lot of people aren't aware that trademarks actually can expire, so make sure you stay on top of that. A more subtle issue that arises when you're operating internationally are these things called implied contracts, and they're something that can come and bite you later on when you haven't really planned for it. And to give you an example, let's say you sign up a distributor in a different country, and you intend that distributor to be non-exclusive, meaning you have plans to maybe sign up a few other distributors in the same country. But let's say you haven't done that. Let's say you sign that first distributor up, and then it's been 3 or 4 years, you haven't signed up another one yet. Now, unless your agreement was crafted very carefully, that first distributor can stop you from adding any distributors in the future. They can claim that it was an implied exclusive contract because they were the only distributor in that country and you haven't set up anybody else. So these are the kinds of things that can bite you later if you haven't crafted. If you said in the original agreement, this is a completely non-exclusive arrangement, then you're fine. But if you've missed something like that, then these are the things that can happen later on. Another thing you'll find when you sign these kinds of contracts is liability. Try not to accept any of these onerous liability clauses in these agreements. Anything that says you're liable up to some obscene amount. What we always try to do is we try to limit the liability in an agreement to the actual amount of the deal. Now let's move on to something that's very important once you get set up in another country, and that's distribution. Distribution is the reason that you're deploying internationally in the first place. You want more users without having to create new apps for them. You want something that builds off of your existing business. There are a lot of great channels online. That's the good news that has happened in the last 10, 15 years especially. But even as you look at these online channels and app stores, don't forget that there are humans behind this. So don't forget to build relationships with the teams behind these channels. They can help you once you get to know them. And typically they're happy to help because each of these channels is also competing with each of the others. So they're happy to have successful apps on their platforms. To give you some examples, for consumer products, the Chrome Web Store from Google is a good option. Basically, these are apps that get installed into the Chrome browser. A lot of people don't really know about it, but it's actually a very good option and gets you a lot of signups. We're a pretty big player there, and we've been pretty happy with the kind of results we're getting. But for business apps, you should look at more B2B marketplaces. Some examples include Google Apps Marketplace, Intuit Marketplace. But as you do that, it's very easy, and if you go look at these marketplaces today, you'll see that a lot of the apps that are listed there don't really integrate very deeply with the platform products, like the Google Apps Suite or the Intuit products. A lot of them are just there for the distribution, so they'll just do a token, tiny bit of integration just so that they're eligible to be on that store, and then the product doesn't really work that well for their users. So try to avoid that, because users can tell the difference. They'll try it and see that it's not really a full-fledged integration if you haven't put in that work. If you go deep and you really put some effort into this, do a big integration, you'll find a lot more customers are willing to part with their money. They'll start paying you a lot more than most of the app makers that are on these stores will get. Writing on another platform like this is a great way to get things going. These guys have a lot more reach than you do, and it's almost foolish not to take advantage of that. One concern you might have when you're listed on an app store or a platform app store like this is you might worry that you're diluting your brand, that you don't really have full control over your user experience. But early on, that's really not what you should be worrying about. Early on, you just really want to generate leads, so focus on that. All of you should know this by now, but AdWords are probably the most promising way still to generate leads and help you target people in specific countries or slice them up by different demographics. This should be your most promising early way of lead generation. Let's talk a little bit about mobile distribution because this deserves some kind of discussion on its own. Mobile app stores, you have to understand, are the lowest hanging fruit that you have access to. The audience, as you know, is massive, and the effort is quite minimal to get your app listed into the store. But you have to be smart about it. You have to choose, when you publish, you have to choose your primary and secondary categories that you're listed in very carefully, because a lot of people will find you, or they will look for apps in these categories, and they'll find you that way. So if you're listed in the wrong category, or worse, you're just not even listed in certain categories, you're giving up a lot of free users right there. You also want to include the right keywords when you publish so that people find you by search. With so many apps on the app stores, a lot of people are just going to search for some keywords and find you that way. You know, in a way, it's a little bit like the web before Google. If any of you remember, Google was a huge jump because before the web, everybody tried to stuff their websites with keywords as much as possible and hope that people would find them that way. The app stores are a little bit like that, unfortunately. So that's the game that you have to play. And both for the categories and search keywords, you have to be constantly refining and iterating all to see what results you're getting and try different experiments, see how they work out. Don't just publish and then forget about it and watch your download count because that won't help you. You have to keep changing what you're doing. And as easy as it is to get into the app stores, that doesn't mean that you don't have to stand out among the millions of other apps. So you do have to put a lot of work into this as well. You do want to monitor your rankings in each country. It's very likely that you'll find a big difference in how well you're doing in certain countries versus certain others. So once you see that, you may want to shift your focus and shift your investment based on that. So maybe your app, for some reason, is doing quite well in Germany. You're not even sure why, but that's enough reason to put more effort into that and maybe invest in better translation, maybe some German market-specific features, whatever it may be. It's a useful information to see where you're doing well. Similar logic applies for which app stores to focus on. The biggest example, iOS versus Android. Most apps, especially if you're serving businesses, have to be on both, but there are still a lot of questions around which one you focus on. You'll find there are a lot of apps that quite naturally fit into the target market of iOS users versus Android users. So if you find that for your app, that gives you an easy answer as to where you should be putting your effort. Let's talk about resellers, because resellers can be a very important part of your international strategy. For online apps, the truth is resellers really just may not be able to help you much early on. That's just something, it's just the way online apps are. It's more difficult for somebody to just take your app and resell it and expect to take some margin on top of you. So it can take quite a while to ramp up. It happened to us too. It took us more than 5 years to see really anything significant through the reseller channel, though it did happen eventually. The key though here for these SaaS apps, online apps, is that the reseller model only really works if they have an opportunity to add value on top of your app. If all they're doing is reselling, they're not going to stick around long because there's just not much opportunity for them to get much. So the first thing you have to do is to figure out if resellers make sense for your product in the first place. If your app, the way it works, isn't really a good fit for the reseller model, don't waste your time chasing it because you're not going to get much. But if it does work, if it does make sense and there's an opportunity for resellers to add value, then by all means pursue it and educate them on what services they can offer on top of your product. Just to illustrate this a little bit with some numbers, if you sell your app for, say, $10 a month, and the reseller gets a 20% cut, that's just $2 a month for them, right? They won't really care that much. But instead, if they can charge $5,000 for training and setup when a new customer comes on board, that's the kind of thing they like. And as sad as that sounds from a customer perspective, the simple truth is, in this industry, for every dollar a business spends on software, they spend on average $7 just getting it set up and making it work for them. So all that training and integration and all that work that goes into that $7, most of that is typically done by resellers. As you enter these new markets, you do want to keep in mind that the first customers you get can make or break you, and there are a bunch of different ways that they can do that. Maybe you're so desperate to get launched in a new market that you go out of your way to provide things that really don't make sense for your business as a whole. There are a lot of ways where it can go wrong. So you do need to remember what we've said earlier at this event, which is sometimes you have to be ready to fire a customer. So just be prepared for that situation. The other question you have to wonder about, how do you gain exposure in a new country? You've set up everything, you have your company incorporated, you have maybe even a reseller agreement, you have all kinds of things set up, but you need to actually gain exposure now, and it's a completely different market. Well, basically there are two broad ways to do this, right? The first way, the most obvious way, is to reach out to users directly. That's called marketing. There's both online and offline marketing, including SEO. And it works, but the problem is it's expensive, right? So what's something else you can do? What's another way you can gain some exposure? You can reach out to influencers instead of all of your users or potential users. That's called PR. And one way you can get started doing this, just make a list of all the top influencers and bloggers in the target country. Include your top trade publications and news sites that you find for your industry. And spend some time watching them. Get to know how all these outlets operate, see how they act, see who among them is covering your competition already. You can set up Google alerts to get pinged whenever this happens. And then pitch those outlets even if you're sitting here. Almost all of them will take briefings over the phone, and they'll be happy to talk to you eventually once you get them to take your call. But as you're doing this, be aware of some of the cultural subtleties that can prevent your message from getting across. It's tough to really go into detail on this here, but it is something that makes a big difference. Because remember, when you're talking about just a few influencers, each of those opportunities is really valuable for you. There's a temptation to just hire a PR firm without thinking too much about it, but just keep in mind, from what we've seen and heard from others, trying to hire a PR firm without a physical presence is almost always doomed to failure. I do want to talk about something you can do to your product to help this whole process, and that's virality. To whatever extent possible, you really should try to build virality into the product. It's really the best way to get users quickly. The simple way, or the simplest way really to do this, is a referral program. And you've all probably seen referral programs in the past. Basically, there are two kinds of referral programs, both single-sided and double-sided. The most famous single-sided example, of course, is Gmail. When Gmail launched back in 2004, as many of you probably remember, you had to get an invite to join, and this created a lot of excitement. And each user, when they got a Gmail account, they started out with just a few invitations that they could send out. There was no reward for them, but it was a nice little privilege for them because they had just a limited number of invitations and they felt like they had some impact in deciding who could be next. So it worked really well for them. In fact, they're trying it again now, 10 years later, with their new inbox app. But I also want to talk about double-sided referral programs. These are becoming more popular in recent months and years. The best example of this is Dropbox. The way Dropbox works, if you're a Dropbox user and you refer somebody, both you and the person you referred will get some extra space. And the Dropbox CEO has said in the past that 30% of their users came through this one program. Now, Dropbox has 300 million users, right? So that means almost 100 million users came through this single program. Another example more close to home, we use this similar setup, a double-sided referral program for Zoho Mail. And more than 20% of our users come in through this program. Ours is a little bit different from Dropbox, though. In our case, the reward is a higher user quota, not more storage space. But the basic principle is the same, and it's worked about as well. And before I go off the stage, I do want to briefly mention what your biggest hurdle will be. And it's not going to be any of the stuff I talked about. It's not going to be getting your hosting figured out. It's not going to be setting up a data center in another country. It's not going to be distribution. It's not going to be supporting your customers. And actually, it's not even going to be your product. So then what is it? It's really just your mindset. And this is what we've seen time and time again. A lot of people, it's very easy and very natural to be intimidated by how unfamiliar another country might be. Even the most successful businesses in one country will start to feel like they have no clue what's happening in a different country, so they don't even try. And that's really the biggest problem, not any of the other stuff that we've talked about, just not even trying. And it's important to remember, there's no magic here, there's no big deal. It's just not that hard, so don't worry about it. If you think you can do this and you put some effort into it, you can, because you're already successful as a business, right? You just need to add a little bit to that and you'll be fine. In fact, every single area that I've talked about in this presentation, we have made mistakes time and time again, every single thing, and it works out eventually. In fact, you will probably find that some countries that you go after, you'll find it easier to operate than here, even if you're less familiar, because frankly, a lot of countries won't have as much red tape as you're used to here. So again, just get started. You can figure it out. And if you have any questions, we'll be around, but we do want to get the next session started. So thank you very much, and all of us will be around.